Hi everyone, my name is Allison Soares and this is my educational thinker presentation for Education 504 at Liberty University. Today I'll be discussing Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was an American psychologist who's most famously known for his humanistic approach to psychotherapy. Carl Rogers really bucked the traditional systems of Sigmund Freud and other psychologists before him, and really wanted to achieve a type of psychotherapy where the relationship between client and therapist was less formal, leaving room for the therapist to be more of a facilitator and for his clients to reach a more self-actualization, self-discovery form of therapy. Now, Carl Rogers wasn't necessarily an educator, but his ideas about the formal relationship between a therapist and the client really bled over into the relationship between teacher and student, and not necessarily the literal relationship between teacher and student, but also between student and peer and student in the classroom. Rogers ended up developing his student-centered approach to learning, which is very similar to that of what we see in existentialism. Definitely that kind of self-actualization, self-discovery, self-motivating classroom style is one that we see a lot in existentialism. So it definitely played a role in his development of his student-centered learning. Now, in his student-centered learning theories, there were three main ideas, or three main facets of that idea. The student-teacher relationship needed to be less informal. The student-peer relationship needed to have what Rogers called an unconditional positive regard, which meant students should feel free to express their ideas no matter how out of the box, no matter how inappropriate. Students should be given room with respect and autonomy to express themselves, to have freedom for self-expression. Finally, the educational climate needed to be that of a safe environment, an unstructured environment where education wasn't being thrusted upon students, but rather they felt safe to explore and discover education for themselves. And so while his entire theory, we don't necessarily see, education today is still very structured. It's still very, some would agree, overly structured and overly mandated. But there are ways that we are seeing this kind of bleed into our modern education. For instance, in your handout, I referenced a article about coaching, about how coaching and teaching follow the same kind of methodology that normally we don't think of athletics in the educational realm, but in fact, the teaching and the coaching of a sport or athletics really finds itself mixed with that of the efforts that are put in with other educators. And so, although the life of an athlete, while different from a student, in that it does produce a more kind of self-expressive, a self-discovery, self-actualization kind of environment. So it's hard for that full allowance of self-actualization to enter the classroom because there do have to be regulations on how much a student is allowed to share about their home life, about things that may be seen as inappropriate in the classroom, not necessarily in their home life. In addition, we see some unstructured influences entering our classroom through flexible seating. It's not something that we pay much attention to these days, but flexible seating is beginning to kind of bleed into different schools. Different school systems allow it, different school systems don't. Sometimes it's up to the teacher to find a way to afford for flexible seating, but kind of that unstructured theme in the classroom where students are allowed to express where they want to sit and how they want to learn in the classroom has kind of shown us how Carl Rogers' humanistic approach has bled into the classroom. And so while I disagree with kind of his approach for self-actualization, I feel like students need structure, They actually crave it without telling us. They would never admit to needing structure, but they kind of crave that structure of what to do every day. What are we learning? How are we learning? So while I don't agree with Carl Rogers on that front, and neither do my friends in some of the articles I've referenced in the handout, but I think in some ways maybe a little bit of that unstructured kind of more relaxed vibe in the classroom actually does lend itself to student exploration, discovery, and maybe an increase in motivation and resiliency in the classroom. And so that was my quick 5-minute presentation on Carl Rogers. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you so much.